The most famous ghost story in American history is this one, the story of the Bell Witch. The Bell Witch story is so fascinating. It's so strange. It's just so bizarre. And there's so much debate today, even over whether or not this actually happened. Although the people involved in this story are historical figures. We do have, I mean, I have a whole dossier of birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, everything about the Bell family, who was a farm family in Adams, Tennessee. Back in the very early 1800s. I think John Bell was born around 1890, and he raised his family in this little cabin that you see the sketch of here on the screen. And he had several children, but the events of the Bell Witch story centered on just 3 members of the family for the most part. And that was John Bell himself, father, his wife Lucy Bell, and their daughter Elizabeth Bell, who the spirit nicknamed Betsy, and that's what she's still known as today, Betsy Bell. The story starts in 1817 at the home, and it started with, you know, kind of those same sort of things that started in the 2 previous cases, in the story of the Wizard Clip and the story of the Dalby Spook. Started with scratching in the walls and knockings in the walls and knockings on the doors. And again, you know, most of these stories, people will tell you, you know, skeptics will tell you that these are poltergeist cases. You know, these are stories that they're not ghost stories. They are, this is some kind of energy that's coming from a living agent. And there's no, you know, spirits or demons or anything like that. I don't think that's necessarily true, especially in these cases that we're talking about today. There are just things in these cases that do not line up with scientifically studied poltergeist cases that parapsychologists study. From the beginning, there was a very quick escalation of events in the Bell cabin. Started with these scratching noises, and the boys also, there were boys that slept in a room together, and they talked about hearing the sound when they turned out the lamp at night. They would hear, they said it sounded like there was a big rat gnawing on the bedpost, and whenever they would flick on the light, the noise would stop. Over time, the noises got louder, and they also started to hear, again, like in the previous case, the sound of the lips smacking or teeth grinding or food being chewed, just from like out of nowhere. The daughter, Betsy Bell, became the central target of all of this. And she, from the beginning, would have her hair pulled. She would feel that she was slapped on the face, and the family would see like a red handprint on her face where she said she had been slapped by something invisible. She was dragged down the stairs by her hair or by her feet. She was thrown against the wall. She was thrown out of bed. She would have her bedclothes pulled off of her all the time in the middle of the night. This was a sketch of Betsy someone did years later. John Bell as well became a target of this spirit, and that came a little bit later. Now, in addition to these things going on in the house, there were things that were going on outside of the house as well. In particular, the family, especially the father and the sons, when they would go out hunting, they started to see this big black, looked like a black wolf, running through the woods and through the farmland around them. And they kept trying to shoot it, but they could never shoot this animal. Many times they thought they did shoot the animal, but that it would just disappear. Around this time that they started to see this animal, they started to hear something else in the house. They started to hear this very faint whisper. And as the days went by, this whisper started to become louder and more audible. So they started to make out words, and it was a faint female voice. And finally, when the voice spoke, it said that it was a spirit, and that it was actually the spirit of someone who had died in the house. They said that there was an Indian's grave, or not had died in the house, but died nearby. They said that there was an Indian that had died nearby years ago, and that the body had been buried, but that the grave of the Indian had been dug up and desecrated. And someone had, the spirit told the family that someone had brought part of the body in the house and had lost a tooth between the floorboards, and that the spirit was there for its missing tooth. That was the first story. So John Bell, after this strange voice told him this story, pried up the floorboards to look for this tooth, because believe it or not, a couple of years earlier, one of his sons had actually found an Indian grave on the property and had dug it up, hoping to find some Indian like artifacts or trinkets in the grave. He found nothing like that, but he brought the jawbone of the Indian into the house, into the Bell cabin. And he, crazy kid, totally disrespectful, threw the jawbone against the wall of the cabin, and it broke. And one of the teeth actually did fall through the floorboard. So John Bell, when he heard this spirit tell him that the spirit had lost a tooth, because the Indian spirit had lost a tooth that had fallen through the floor, he remembered that his son had this tooth fall through the floorboard. So he pried up the floorboards, and there was nothing there. And at that point, this voice became very loud, and it sounded like a cackling witch. And it laughed and laughed and laughed and made fun of John Bell prying up the floorboard and said, "It's totally untrue. I made it up. It's just a joke. That's not who I am at all." So that was the first lie. The second lie that the spirit told was that it was a traveler who had buried a big amount of treasure on the Bell property near the creek, actually near the Red River nearby. If you've ever been to Adams, the beautiful Red River runs right through this area. So they were the family was pretty still, kind of stinging from the last lie that the Bell Witch had told them. Oh, by the way, the reason this, actually, I'll get to that in a second. I'll just keep saying Bell Witch, and I'm going to tell you why it's called the Bell Witch in a second. So the family, wasn't very quick to believe the new story, but finally they decided to go check it out. The spirit told them that the treasure was buried under a huge rock by the river, and she gave very specific instructions about where it was and where to dig. And when they got there, they realized how precise these directions were and how precisely described the area was. And they spent half a day holing this huge rock off of the site where the spirit told them this treasure was buried. When they took the rock out, they found nothing there. And when they got back to the house that night, once again, the voice of the spirit, cackling with laughter, began to tell the story to them about step by step all the trouble they had had trying to lift this rock off the site that she had told them the treasure was at. And she was making fun of them and laughing hysterically. And she just knew every detail about what had happened that day. So time goes on, and a few weeks later, another story comes. While they're around dinner one night, the spirit's voice speaks, and she says, "I am Kate Batt's witch." Now, Kate Batt was a neighbor of the Bells, and she was known as an eccentric woman. Her husband was ill, and he was not able to farm or keep up the homestead. So she had to do everything herself. She's probably a really remarkable woman, actually. But because of all this, and because she kept to herself, she was known as very eccentric. And we don't really know if she was known as a witch at the time, or if that was something that came later. If people, people used to talk about people at that in those days. But at any rate, she was known to be eccentric and things like that. Excuse me, one second. Excuse me. So the spirit apparently was saying that she was, now when you said that you, at that time, if someone said that someone was someone's witch, that referred to like a familiar, an evil spirit, a demon, a devil that does the bidding of a witch. So the spirit was claiming that it was basically a demon who was doing work for Kate Batts, this neighbor. Now, the reason why the spirit said Kate Batts was tormenting the Bell family was that there had been a property issue between John Bell and Kate Batts, where I think Kate Batts had bought some land from John Bell, and John Bell had charged her too much. And this was against the church law at the time. So there was actually a church hearing about this, where the pastor of the church scolded and took John Bell to task for overcharging Kate Batts for this land. So this land dispute was apparently the source of Kate Batts basically unleashing this demon on the Bell family. And again, we don't know if any of this is true, but this is the story. So things get worse and worse and worse. And this voice is the thing that becomes the central, tormenting, relentless characteristic of this haunting. It is heard night and day by the entire family, and it has a different personality for everyone in the family. John Bell, it hates. And from the beginning, the spirit or the witch constantly tells John Bell that it's going to kill him. Betsy Bell continues to be physically attacked by the spirit. Hair pulled, thrown out of bed, pulled down the stairs, scratched, bitten, slapped. The spirit or the witch tells Betsy that she will not leave her alone until she breaks off her courtship with this local boy in town. I'm sorry, the opposite, until she gets together and marries this local boy in town. And this is a story that leads people later on to wonder if Betsy Bell was actually staging all of this because she wanted to marry this boy in town, and she was kind of trying to scare him into it. I don't know why, what rationale that would be. I don't know what guy would marry her to try and stop this crazy stuff from happening. I would run as far away as possible. But at any rate, these are the things that are happening. The witch or the spirit had this particular affection for Lucy Bell, the mom. When she was sick, the witch or the spirit would sing these beautiful Christian spiritual songs to her. She would, the witch or the spirit would do the chores for Lucy Bell, fold the laundry and do the laundry, cook the food, wash the dishes with no one would see any of this happen. It would just be done. A time when Lucy was very extremely sick, the witch's voice was filled with torment and sorrow. People, they could hear the witch crying and sobbing and saying, "Oh, Luce, 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 oh, I can't believe you're so sick, Luce. This is breaking my heart, Luce. You must get well, Luce. If anything happened to you, Luce, I would never know what to do." It's really amazing. So this all, and there's so many stories in here. There's books and books written about this. As a matter of fact, this one book, this was a book that, there were several books. There was a book written by a family member some years after the end of the events, which was in 1821. And then there was this book, Our Family Trouble, which was written by a journalist some years later. And there's all sorts of questions about if he made some of this stuff up, if he exaggerated it, or what have you, because by the time these books were written, all of the firsthand eyewitnesses had died. So there weren't any, eyewitness accounts that were given to any of the people that wrote these books. One of the weirdest things that happened in the situation, you might have seen this if you saw the episode on Ghost Adventures about the Bellwich Cave. That was on, we'll get to that in a minute. That was on, I think it was on last year, or maybe it was this season. I'm not sure. I don't really watch the show, but I did watch it last week. in preparation for this. As part of that show, they went to the house of a man named Porter. And Porter is like the great, 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 great grandson of a farmer named Porter, who very famously caught the Bell Witch. And you see this illustration from one of the books. He had been visiting the Bell family and had gone home later that evening, and the witch apparently came with him. Because when he went to bed that night, Farmer Porter heard the witch's voice in the room with him. And the witch said, "Move over, John. I've come to sleep with you and keep you warm." Well, Porter wasn't afraid of the Bell Witch at all. He never had been. And he said, "Well, come on, get in, but if you keep me awake, I'm throwing you out of bed." So he feels this, he said it felt like this snake-like thing, like slithering up under the covers. And he wrapped it up with the blankets. And you can see this awesome illustration of Farmer Porter with this thing, this spirit, the Bell Witch, wrapped up in this blanket. And what he intended to do was to go across the room and to throw it into the fire. But as he went from the bed to the fireplace, he said this object took on this stench, this horrific, horrific stench. And it became heavier and heavier and heavier until he could no longer hold it. And he literally could not stand the smell. So he threw it on the floor, and he ran outside into the snow and was just gulping up, like mouthfuls of air, fresh air. And when he went back into the house, he just saw the empty blanket on the floor, and the sound, the voice of the witch was gone. But when he went back to the Bell farm the next day, the witch had returned and, of course, told the whole family the story, very laughingly, of course, about how Farmer Porter had tried to capture her and destroy her, but of course she had gotten away from him. Now, in 1920 or 1821, what brings this story to an end is the death of John Bell. And it remains one of the biggest mysteries in the annals of the paranormal, because John Bell is, for what we know of the case and what we're told, poisoned. And many people at the time believed that, and some still do today, believe that John Bell was poisoned by the Bell Witch. There was, the story always went that he was ill, and then one morning, Lucy came in to wake him up and to see what he needed, and found that he was dead in his bed, and that there was this vial of strange liquid on the nightstand next to his bed. The firsthand accounts that I've actually read lately, more current for the time accounts, said that there was actually a vial of poison that was found in the chimney later on, that it wasn't actually on his nightstand. And of course, there were no autopsies or anything like that at that time, so nobody ever knew what actually happened. But the legend began, which still holds today, that John Bell was poisoned by the Bell Witch. And so oftentimes you will hear people talk about that oftentimes people say, well, can a spirit kill you? And people will often say the only time someone has been killed by a spirit was when John Bell was killed by the Bell Witch in 1821. Now, there was a prediction that the witch made when she left, and she said that she was going to come back. She said she was going to come back because the family was cursed, and she was going to keep visiting them periodically, for the duration of the Bell family line. Excuse me. A big date which she predicted she would come back was 1937. And in 1937, there were some strange things that happened. There was the new owner of the farm, the Bell family farm, talked about these strange experiences that were happening, not in the cabin, but in the cave, this cave that's on the property, the old Bell property. That cave today is known as the Bellwich Cave, and it's a big haunted attraction. You can go there, and there are tours that go into the cave. And the cave has been the site of many paranormal experiences over these many years. If you go to the cave, the family that runs this attraction, they have built a facsimile cabin on the site. What was left of the original Bell cabin was moved into town, and you can still see that part of that if you go to like to the town hall in Adams. And you can see the Bell family graves in the cemetery in town and things like that. So there are signs around town that talk about the Bell Witch. I'll come back to this in a second. So there's signs here that, you know, historic markers to talk about the Bell Witch. There's the grave of John Bell. That's the death scene. But in 1937, there was newspaper articles all over Tennessee, you know, is the witch going to come back? And people were really afraid that this was going to happen, that the Bell Witch was going to come back and torment the new people that were living on the property, or torment the descendants of John Bell. So things are happening in the Bellwich Cave. The person who now owns that land is saying that they're hearing moaning sounds coming from inside of the Bellwich Cave on the old Bell property. Descendants of John Bell in their own homes, scattered now all over the country, talking about knockings on the walls of their houses, the feeling of something rubbing up against them, objects flying around their homes, whistles, and the sound like hands clapping, things like that. So several descendants of John Bell in their different homes in different places around the country in 1937 report strange things going on. That same year, there was a picnic that was put on by a local club, and they had a wiener roast in a quarry near the Bellwich Cave. This was in July of 1937. And the group was joking about the story of the Bell Witch when one of them saw this woman in a long dress sitting on the edge of the cliff above the cave. And they apparently took off and left all their wieners and fixins and punch and everything else behind and took off down the street. What else happened? Some other strange things happened in later years. There was furniture from the house that people had bought that was said to be haunted, especially a rocking chair that had belonged to one of the Bell family. And people said that there were strange voices that would be heard around this rocking chair. There was a very bizarre story. There were many other stories about the Bellwich Cave that still go on today. This was the weirdest story. In 1987, there was a man named Sanders who owned a gas station near the old Bell farm. And he said that in 1967, 20 years before when he gave this report, so in 1967, he had run out of gas near the Red River, which is right across from the Bell farm. And he began to walk towards town to get some help to get some gas and get his car started. And he said that a rabbit came out of the woods and started to follow him. And it started to, he started to walk faster, and then the rabbit walked faster. And then he started to run, and the rabbit started running after him. So then after running a mile, the man sat down on a log to catch his breath. He had been so spooked out by this rabbit. He sat down on a log to catch his breath, and the rabbit hopped up next to him and said to him, "Hell of a race we had there, wasn't it?" Creepy. Which brings us to, let me just tell you really quickly. We're going to get into talking animals now after that, but let me tell you really quickly. As I mentioned, the Bellwich Cave today is a big paranormal attraction that has tours, and you might have seen it on Ghost Adventures when they investigated it over this past year. But I don't know if you've ever been there, but the weirdest thing about the Bellwich Cave is that at the entrance to the cave, there's some sort of like a vortex or something like that, some sort of energy vortex. When people take photographs of the entrance to the cave, the photographs oftentimes don't come out right. People will come out with like limbs of their bodies missing, or their heads missing, or just maybe just their torso without their legs. Sometimes they come out upside down. Sometimes there's like a double exposure, even though it's a digital camera and that's impossible. Sometimes there will be other people in the photos with them that weren't in the picture or aren't even there, or like back at home, states away. Very, very weird things. And in fact, if you go there, the owner of the property has this huge photo album, scrapbook thing filled with these pictures. In fact, I was surprised I didn't find any of them online. I wanted to share with you. But if you go there, there's this whole huge book, probably like this thick, filled with these pictures. It's just really crazy. I wanted to pop on here and add an addendum to this, because I think it's something that's very important about this case that I did not include in this talk. And that is that at one point during the manifestations at the Bell Farm, this single voice of the Bell Witch broke off into 4 distinct voices, which one of the family members referred to as a family of spirits or a family of demons. And this is really interesting because a demonologist will tell you, exorcists will tell you, that demons travel in packs. There's not just one. So if someone is possessed, it's not just one. There's a pack of them. And you see this kind of thing happen in a number of cases. And we're going to be talking in the weeks to come about another case referred to as the Devil in Texas, which was one of Hans Holzer's cases. And this also appeared on the Holzer Files on the Travel Channel last year, I believe it was. And where you had manifestations that started with one disembodied voice and it turned into a lot of different voices, and they would sometimes be nice and sometimes be very evil. And that was the case here on the Bell Farm with the Bell Witch case. So these 4 voices called themselves Black Dog, Mathematics, Psychopathy, and Jerusalem. These were the names that they said were theirs. And they would argue with each other. And each one had a different distinct personality and a distinct voice. And they also had different like kind of levels of authority, like you would in a family. But they would very often argue with each other. Oftentimes they appeared drunk. They all appeared drunk, and there would actually be a smell of alcohol, whiskey, that would pervade the house when these voices would manifest and they would appear to be drunk. And when questioned about it, the voices said that they were drunk and they had gotten the alcohol from a neighbor's still near the Bell Farm. It was very strange because not only would these voices constantly argue with each other and things like this, but oftentimes too, they would sing very beautifully. And oftentimes it was sacred hymns, just like the single voice would do. Sometimes the single voice would, as we mentioned, quote scripture and sing religious hymns in this beautiful voice. And this was the same thing with these 4 voices. Sometimes they would sing these beautiful hymns. So again, I have the quote on there from the Apostle Paul, who talked about, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light sometimes. And, we see this all through, the paranormal, where mediums and psychics, clairvoyants will get these messages supposedly from people who have passed away, saying, I'm angry about this, I'm sad about this, I have a message for somebody, or, I have this treasure that I left behind that, I need you to find, things like that. But you have to be so careful, because never, or almost never, I think never, does a human spirit come back for a reason like this, to give us a message, or unless it's, please pray for me. This just doesn't happen. So we saw very clearly in the Bellwich case that, whatever this spirit was, lied right off the bat, said it was first that Indian spirit whose tooth was under the floorboards, and then said it was a peddler who had buried the treasure out by the rock on the Red River, and so on and so forth. So, and then said it was Kate Batts' familiar. So you can't trust these demons. You cannot trust spirits at all, because you never know when it's a demon that's lying to you. And probably 90% of the time or more, that's what you're coming up against. So I just wanted to point out this detail of this case about the 4 voices that emerged from the single voice, because we are going to see that in another case coming up. And I think it's really shows, sheds a lot more light on that demonic aspect of this case that's not pointed out a lot. So just wanted to pop that in there. So thanks so much for joining me today. We are going to keep talking about extreme hauntings in the weeks to come. So join me back for the live premieres on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. And until then, take good care. Make sure you subscribe, hit the like button for this video, and ring the notification bell so you get notified every time we have something new come up, either on this series or on the channel. I've got some cool documentaries and readings coming up too. So make sure that you hit that notification bell. Have a great night.